Okay, so now I'll start the recording. And first, let me introduce the Professor Jim Meekling. And he's the professor of the applied linguistics and the TESOL at the University of London. And today he will going to talk about something, his paper called the English-only English media instructions mixes the views in Thai and Vietnamese higher education. And this paper mainly explores some phenomena like the preferences in the preferences of the English-only instructions, and also explores some concepts like the native speakerism and also the language policy, top-down language policy. So now, first of all, the Jim will introduce some part of his paper, and then his open discussions. The rest of time is for open discussions, and so we have plenty of time to ask questions or share your thoughts. So now I will give the microphone to Jim, and I mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Xiao, and thank you everyone for coming to this reading group today. I am going to just kind of talk about a few highlights from the paper, and then mainly I want to spend the time discussing and addressing your questions. One of the things about this area of research, English medium instruction, is it is most commonly defined using a definition that was put forward by Ernesto Maccaro in 2018, published in 2018. It was actually also very similarly stated earlier by Ernesto Maccaro and reported by Julie Dearden in the 2014 British Council report. So that definition of English medium instruction is based on a European model of EMI. And the thing about that definition is it focuses very strictly on the language policy. And that language policy being that the medium of instruction is English in a context where English isn't usually used for education purposes. Now, that definition is very useful. People continue to cite that definition in contextualizing in EMI in publications on the topic. But it's a bit problematic when we look at the rapid spread of EMI, particularly in East Asia, with the focus for today on Southeast Asia, because the policy of EMI kind of comes with this understanding that there's going to be an element of English language development, skills development around language. So that is the reason why last year, so I was invited to write an encyclopedia entry on English medium instruction. And it has been published at the end of 2024 in a kind of section by Elsevier called Research Module in Social Sciences, something like that. So there's thousands of entries in this online encyclopedia. So I put that definition in the chat at the beginning, but I think I need to do it again. So let me go back up to it. Let's see if I can get this in the chat again. All right, so you can see, hopefully that copied right. Yes, okay. So you can see here it says EMI is the teaching of academic content through English in settings where other languages have traditionally been used as mediums of instruction. Now, this is the important bit. With an intention, stated or unstated, of developing learners' skills for using English for specific academic purposes. So the link to that source is there, and yeah, so it's kind of on its way to being published in an encyclopedia that I think has a 2026 date on it. But the thing about this understanding of what English medium instruction is, it has this dual purpose. Now, you're probably wondering, how does this differ from CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning? The thing about CLIL is it's housed in language education, right? So yes, it has the content built into part of the development, but the thing about that is it sits in that under that umbrella more neatly, right? EMI is an educational policy that has these kind of unstated, most of the time, ideas about language development. Now, that is very important for our understanding of this paper, because in this study, what we did was we drew on a pretty robust body of evidence that was collected by our second author, Nicola Galloway, and who actually traveled through all of Southeast Asia for an extended period of time, funded by British Council, I should probably clarify. And with that data, we recognized that the understanding that I've highlighted here in this definition of EMI was an important one for us to understand coming from our different contexts. So just to be clear, so Carrie Shahan, who's first author on this and did the main analysis of the data, and Nicola and I, none of us have lived and worked in Southeast Asia. So Nicola and I both have our kind of extensive EMI experience in Japan, and Carrie's is in Turkey. So we do have this kind of lived experience, but not specifically in this part of the world. So I say that kind of as a caveat. So for people who have that experience, you would like to correct anything or provide further reflections on some of the results that we found based in the data, please do share those and we can kind of work through them to clarify understanding about it. So as Xiao said in her introduction, in this paper, there is a focus on things like the policy, an English-only policy that institutions have, as well as native speakerism, and yeah, kind of dealing with those aspects of how particular standards of English usage are reflected in policy and practice. So in this kind of large data set, so just to clarify, there were 1,377 student responses to the questionnaire, and then there were 83 EAP teachers and 148 content teachers. And then there were interviews with 35 students, 31 EAP teachers, and 28 content teachers. Interviews, and then also 14 focus groups. So huge body of data. Now, the thing with this is, of course, framing how we understood what the responses were kind of evolved as we went through this. So we had this huge data set. Carrie and I kind of came onto it with our own ideas about how to interpret what was being understood. And there are some things that I feel are important to clarify that I didn't get to include in this paper. And they are things like, where participants reflected a desire for native-like fluency or native fluency, or seemed to favor, these issues around native speakerism. The important thing is it's not clear exactly how people understood the concept of native speakerism. It could very well be that what they were describing was simply that, the desire for, and the focus really was on the teachers, right? That teachers should have a native use of English, that maybe that simply means that they are intelligible, right? So we don't have that kind of nuanced understanding of those specific aspects. And that's certainly something that we kind of highlighted as something that should be further discussed. And it actually has been something that, for example, Nicola has flagged several times in publications over the last kind of 6-7 years. So yeah, this is this idea about whose English is it, what standard of English is it that we're talking about in contexts where policies may require the use of English now, or only the use of English. Now we recognize, I'm sure everybody here, understands that, whatever kind of educational policies regarding practice are in place, when it comes down to it, teachers and students are going to do what they need to do to be able to reach learning objectives. So, and this was reflected in our data, right? That where EAP teachers may have, described their situation as mainly using English, they would draw on the local language to help support reaching learning objectives in class. Content teachers even more so, right, would describe drawing more on the local language, and even, kind of describing a kind of situation where it was sort of, because of limited understanding of English, we would use the local language. So that's an important thing to recognize, because this sort of deficit model of the use of the local language can be a bit problematic, and I'm definitely open to your thoughts about that. But that was the way that it was presented in the data that we had, and so that was how we presented it in our findings. The other important thing about all of this, actually kind of final thing about it, is just that the idea of translanguaging, which we do mention, I was going to resist saying it. It's a kind of contentious concept, but because we do write about it in this paper, I feel it's important to say something about it. The idea of translanguaging has kind of evolved. We've used the kind of more current, more popular understanding about it, which is really pedagogical translanguaging. So the idea that teachers are kind of using multiple languages or kind of fluidly moving between languages in order to draw on the linguistic repertoires available to them in the classroom, that this is taking advantage of that. But of course, the thing to keep in mind is the origins of translanguaging have everything to do with a learning strategy, right? So the idea is, even in an English-only environment where students are right, where all of the content being delivered is in English, it doesn't mean that those learners aren't doing their own translanguaging, right? That they are receiving information and doing translations and kind of shifting and recognizing, oh, this is what was said in English. I can make a connection to that with this other language that I have to understand it, right? To kind of grasp this concept. So that isn't illustrated here in this paper, but this is something I just kind of wanted to clarify as part of our conversations, Carrie, Nicola, and I, when we kind of came into this. We recognized this wasn't the space for that kind of discussion, so we just kind of went ahead with the popular understanding about translanguaging, but that was something I also wanted to just open up to the group. So those all my caveats. I hope I haven't opened up too much, but I'm definitely open to any questions you have and comments.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for your introductions. And so, does anyone have some questions or want to share your thoughts with us, with the Professor King? Professor Jin? Yes. And feel free to share your thoughts and engage in a conversation. I think you may, yes, you can raise your hands or type in the chat. Yes. And maybe you can say something about that. What's your previous ideas before you're reading the articles? And do you have changed your ideas? Or yes, does the paper reinforce your ideas? Yes.
Yes. Did anybody else go through the evolution that the authors did?
Okay, I saw some Beatora and raise her hand. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes.
Okay, so maybe I'll go first. So
hi.
hello, Jim. I'm Qingyang, actually, Qingyang Sun from Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University, and I think you have handled my paper one time some years ago in system.
I do recognize your name.
Okay, right. Yeah, I'm also very much interested in the EMI as a research topic, and I also currently work in an EMI institution. So yeah, I think after reading this paper, well, firstly, I find it's very informative, and it's based on such a big amount of data, and I think it will be very useful for any practitioner working in that or policymaker in that context. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, for EMI, I guess one issue right now is that the context is very different for different places. So, well, like your data, you have people from Vietnam, from many East Asian countries, and maybe in those places, like if the students, like you said, if they have a limited English proficiency, then maybe yes, they are more likely to use some local language in the teaching. But I guess for some other contexts, perhaps like in European contexts where students maybe have a higher level of English proficiency, right? Or even like in my case, Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University is a joint venture between a Chinese university and the UK university. So yeah, on the one side is the policy does ask us to say everything in English. I think until now, even the president, one time, he emphasized that please keep all the meetings and classes in English. Yeah, so that's maybe because, well, our students do have quite good English proficiency as well. So yeah, my comment is just I feel it's very various situation in different contexts.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you raised this point, because it is interesting to think about how the policy gets interpreted, right? So, it's interesting, of course, at XJTLU, the kind of UK imprint is very strong. And I think we see that in a lot of the transnational universities in China, and that we've written about that as well. And, this study was a partial replication of Rose and Galloway with their research on data collected in China and Japan. And so we used the same research questions. And it was really interesting. I think that was the thing about this particular context with the Thai and Vietnamese students in particular, that what they described as their kind of desire for their teachers to have native like fluency was so prominent. And that was different from what was seen in Rose and Galloway in China and Japan, where yes, it was there, but there was a kind of a different understanding about what they expected their EMI instructors, whether it's EAP or content teachers, to sound like, I guess, right, in terms of intelligibility. For me, I think what that means is there's a kind of different history of the implementation of EMI in those contexts, right? That because even though, right, we know that it's kind of top-down policy implementation, the practices in those places were, I think, according to Rose and Galloway anyway, the practices in the data collected in China and Japan reflected this idea that people understood that those policies were kind of there to guide, right? Whereas I think with the student participants in our data in Vietnam and Thailand, the students really saw this as, no, this policy is in place for a good reason, right? The policy is English only because that's going to help us. And, our teachers who are not using English are cheating us. And I think that was the thing that was just so kind of striking, right, about this difference. Now, I know, right, I mean, in the transnational universities in China, especially, the prestigious ones like XJTLU, there's a different attitude, I think, by the students toward it. They recognize, right, that, engaging in English at the level that they are, and it's like you say, right, I mean, the proficiency levels are different in these spaces, leads to different attitudes towards those policies. And I think that's the issue. I think so. I think you kind of nailed it when you identified proficiency as the issue. I think in Thailand and Vietnam, with our participants in that study, because the proficiency levels were lower, they believed that English only was the answer. But right, in practice, we know it's not.
Yeah, like even in my institution, like you said, the policy and like I said, policy says you need to use English. But still, even in this university, actually, the reality is, when it comes to things like supervision or a student communicating with a teacher, it's not always the case. But the ironic thing, I think, is like everyone, still a lot of the teachers and the students, they actually believe that I have to say things in English. It's kind of because we have this EMI policy, they interpret it as I have to speak in English no matter what. And I think that's where the problem is. So they, at some point they should know that it's a policy, but what you decide to do, there's some flexibility there.
Yeah. No, that's the thing, right? I mean, it's we have to use English even if it's detrimental to communication and learning. That's definitely the issue. Emmanuel put I appreciate these comments in here about context. In some contexts, the policies aren't clear, and teacher proficiency is an issue. And I know that's in our data as well. We definitely noted that, but it was hard because it wasn't specific, right? It wasn't like hey, teachers and students, do you think you believe this way because your proficiency level is low? It's sort of like that wasn't something we were really able to say, or Nicola in the data collection and in the interviews and focus groups. She wasn't able to kind of make that argument. Fair enough, right? I didn't think that would be hard to do.
Thank you, Jim, for
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And okay, Paul also raised his hand, so please.
Thank you, Xiao. And hi, Jim. Sorry for bothering you, but I have a couple of questions. One which is related specifically to your research, and the other one is a little bit more general. But let's start with the specific one related to the research, because I'm probably the least knowledgeable person about EMI in this room, but it is quite related to what I'm interested in. And what I want to ask is, I see all this research that's being conducted, but it's not obvious to me what comes next in the research. Because, for example, if you ask me what comes next what is still missing in your field, I could talk about it for hours probably. But when I look at EMI, I'm like, okay, I get it. What should we be looking at next? Yeah, that's the first question.
Yeah, no, thank you, because it actually reminds me, there was something that when I was going back through this article, I had highlighted something that Carrie had put in, and really toward the end, I think it is on the last page, so page 673, where it's highlighted about a point that Nicola had made years earlier, that there's been little exploration into why the participants thought this way and its relation to the dominance of native speakerism and standard language ideology. So we call for more exploration into the factors influencing these attitudes in this context. So I think, ideally we would say what comes next is like policy change, but I think the problem is we don't know enough yet, right? I think if we have if we have a more comprehensive understanding of the situation, then we could move into some policy adaptations. But I think for now, we still just have these kind of really important questions that we just don't really have answered yet. And so for me, that's what's next. It's more of this kind of thing, trying to understand why is it being interpreted this way. So that was that thing I kind of wanted to say I tried to kind of hint at in the very beginning, is that our participants in this study may very well not have understood what they meant by native speaker, right? So this is so I don't mean to kind of further problematize. I just think that this is something that if we have some clear data on this aspect, that we could do more toward kind of creating a clearer policy.
Yeah, I see. I get it. No, thank you so much. And actually, this partly answers my second question, which is a little bit more general, and I think a little bit more difficult to answer, because quite rightly, you've been mentioning about, EMI, it's contextualized differently in different parts of the world. For example, I think I'm one of the few apparently lucky students of English that didn't learn English in an EMI environment, but I did experience things like, native speakerism, but that's not just necessarily related to English, because I learned quite a few languages, and this native speakerist tendency was, again, in everything that I learned, including my first language. And so the difficult question I want to ask is it possible for us to tackle and to address native speakerism in English without considering its realization in other languages as well? Because I don't have any evidence, but I just get the feeling that it reinforces the one in English coming from maybe the learner's first language or from the other languages that we learn.
It's interesting, because I was kind of going through my own reflections on learning other languages, and the European languages that I was exposed to younger and that I studied were French and Danish. So these two languages that were really difficult to pronounce, and really struggled to have any kind of native like fluency. And honestly, I just remember feeling really discouraged and not So I think this is where we see, it's an example of the kind of stark difference, right? That English is this, it's this super active global language that's used more often by non-native users than native users. So in that way, I think it takes a really different form. I think when we talk about modern foreign languages or when we talk about foreign language learning, it's tricky putting English in the same list as, as other languages. And even the ones that have this, similar reach, like Spanish or Arabic, right, where we see, where we have, Spanish as a lingua franca in parts of the world, Arabic as a lingua franca in parts of the world. So, even in those examples, it still doesn't have the same impact because we just don't have the same numbers. I have argued before, but never actually managed to publish it anywhere. But it's been removed from papers in the past. That when we talk about the English and EMI, that really we're not talking about a language in the same way that we talk about other languages. And I was trying to kind of make the argument that it's almost like English isn't a language anymore; it's this other thing. But yeah, that's a too difficult of a kind of philosophical approach to reconceptualizing English. But I think there is a lot of reconceptualization that we have seen in terms of practices of the use of English. So not the teaching of English, but the use of English in all these different educational contexts. So for me, I think it's there, right? And that's why, EMI and the kind of combination of EMI and global Englishes as these kind of, two areas that come together, especially as the focus areas for ELINet, are essential for moving forward on this topic. Because I think that's otherwise we just get bogged down. And so I think I guess what I want to say is I think it's fair that in other language education that there is this kind of focus on that objective, because I think that's what those languages can offer. I think for English, because they're so different, right, in terms of the purpose of what you're doing with that language and the uses of it, and using it as a medium of instruction and education, across, in so many parts of the world. I mean, I'm amazed with my doctoral student, Talera Simie, to learn that in Ethiopia, all of secondary education and all of higher education is English medium. Policy, not necessarily practice. But right, it's just kind of like, oh my God. So we're dealing with these policies that are adopted for many different reasons, but because of that reality, I think that's why we have to try to interpret and understand the goals of the use of English in these educational spaces differently.
All right. No, thank you. It was good to have this perspective. So I need to consider this when I think about it as well. Thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah, no, thank you, Paula.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also Bridge Goodman. Yes, also raised his hand. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for this lovely opportunity to not only read your work, or at least skim your work. I'll have to reread it more closely later when I assign it to students. But to talk about it, I have a comment and then a question, because that's where I'm at in my career. So I just want to say that your findings about what I call monoglossic ideologies, heteroglossic practices, I've seen in other contexts. So I'm glad that you're able to highlight that in the paper, that they ideally say we should only use English, but in practice, other languages come in. And that's what makes Paolo's studying EMI as a phenomenon is so important, because it is about English in other contexts and it does change the dynamic. What I want to ask about, what I'm curious about, because this framing is new for me, is linking native speaker ideologies with a global English's framework. So if I understand correctly, you're not looking at it in terms of a localized form of English, or at least it's ambiguous whether they mean foreigner as the qualitative data indicated, or whether it also includes Thai and Vietnamese speakers of English using a local variety. I think that's something to explore further. But I'm also curious whether based on the universities that participated in the mixed methods study, how much choice students in those universities actually have. I mean, if I think about the Kazakh context, are these students studying at a branch campus or an internationalized university that has a diverse array of English speakers, or is it a state or regional university that mostly has locals who barely have enough English, as Emmanuel said, to teach in English? Do you know if do you have data on to characterize the universities to help tease that part out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hugely important question. And I think that was the thing about kind of, Carrie and I coming in on this massive data set that Nicole had brought home with her. Because the rural urban divide, right? I mean, it's just incredible that, depending on the universities or the transnational universities, to kind of lump those together with the urban universities, or the older, the kind of older traditional universities in a national context, that they have these uses of English that are not reflected, even though the policy may be exactly the same in other parts of the country, in terms of how English is used. And it has so much to do with just the limited proficiency in those places, because they're just not exposed to global uses of English in the same way. So yeah, the issues really differ in those contexts. So the idea of kind of, global Englishes, this is an idea that people in those kind of, the urban areas or the transnational context, right, they can entertain these ideas, right? Because they think, okay, yeah, I get global Englishes and I get local uses of English and I get that. Whereas in the kind of, limited proficiency that could be found in other parts of the country and in those other universities, it's very different, right? The idea of making a difference between, kind of world Englishes or different varieties of English versus native uses of English doesn't really register. It's sort of this point where you think, this is the English that's in our materials, this is the English that we're reading, there's a kind of global standard as far as publications in English go, up for debate, of course, but that's what they're working with. And so the idea of making a distinction between the global English's ideology or global English's framework and native speakers, and doesn't really necessarily apply just because of the proficiency level. Does that make sense? Because Bridget, I'm actually thinking about, there was because there was somebody from a more rural Kazakh university who I asked the question about, the uses of English, and she looked really confused with my question, because it was kind of like, what do you mean we use English? It doesn't really, it's English. It's the English that we use. And it was kind of that was as far as it went. Is that what you're getting at? Is it that
yeah, I think,
yeah.
I mean, actually it's taking me in a new direction. So it almost sounds like the identification of different varieties of English, or the access to different varieties, is almost in itself a marker of global citizenship, of plurilingual competence, and that people who have more access to those spaces because they're in urban, internationalized universities and cities will be able to articulate that in ways that people in other contexts won't. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and then it raises the question of how important is it? How effective is it? I think, because I don't want to suggest to anybody here that it's not important. I think it's very important. But it becomes more or less important, I think, depending on the context and proficiency levels. I think. Is that good? Emmanuel put there's a question in the chat, and she's keeping safe. I think she's driving.
My husband is.
So the question about replicating the research in different contexts or only for Asian contexts, I mean, this is a really good question, because I think it's highly problematic. So this kind of replication is interesting. So Heath Rose, right, who has worked really hard with people like Ikuya Aizawa to kind of develop this questionnaire and kind of work from there. So that questionnaire has been used for replication studies in a lot of different contexts, and obviously it needs to be adapted for those contexts. But it's interesting because it's one of those things where you look at that published research, and honestly a lot of that published research gets cited a lot because the responses to that questionnaire really do dig deep into some interesting points. But right, it's a bit like this point about rural and urban, right? So it's sort of like Asian and European models of EMI, the use of English is just very different in as far as educational policy and practice goes. It's not easy to kind of draw a line between the two and say, oh, there's European EMI and Asian EMI, because, right, obviously there's a lot of mixing. And this was a real challenge for Nicola and me when we were editing that book on international perspectives of EMI practices, because initially when we proposed that book to Bloomsbury, we said we didn't want to do national divide. And we wanted to kind of look at macro levels, meso, micro, and just go from there. But they said that wouldn't be marketable, palatable for readers. I get it. And so that was why we ended up with kind of dividing it up by, national context. But I think this is the thing with something like this in terms of replicating these studies, is to ensure that when it's adapted for that other context, that all of these other aspects are taken into consideration about what the language is supposed to be doing, what the expectations about the language, what they're supposed to be doing. Because I think this was one of the problems for me, and Carrie, like when the two of us especially were kind of talking through, because I know Nicola, as the person who collected the data, had her deep understanding about what she had done. But we were kind of really digging into this point, like, but did the respondents understand what native speaker, what native speaker is? Did that make sense to them? And does a native speaker not use other languages? Is a native speaker a monolingual speaker? Is it, so there were all of these kind of questions that we had so Nicola had answers to our questions, but not necessarily able to dig it out of the data. So that's the kind of thing, I think, when replicating this kind of research in other places, you'd have to kind of think through all of that stuff first for the data collection to be as effective as it can be. I think that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And does anyone still want to share or talk with Jane? Oh, yes. Margarita.
Margarita.
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry.
Like the drink, I always say, like the drink. It's easier to remember. So, like, I was really, well, thank you. This is, I think, the first time that I have the chance to speak with the researcher from, like, a really important paper. So, thank you for being here. I'm planning on doing my dissertation regarding the English only use inside the classroom. I know that's kind of a different topic, but I have researched a lot about this topic in particular, and all the research said, like, yeah, it's important, especially in beginner level, to kind of support yourself with the L1. But why do you think that we still have, like, students and teachers have this perception that is something bad, like you shouldn't do it? After all the research that has been done, like, especially I live in Chile, and we still have this perception, like, it's also something like a policy. It's not like stated as policy, but they recommend the use of English only inside the classroom. But why? Like, I understand maybe, like, okay, so you have to use English, of course, but we should also, like, we have this ideal scenario where everyone speaks the same language, so we don't have to switch languages. But why, after all this research, we still have this, like, conception that it's not good, or it's bad, or if it's better to have, like, a native speak. I know that's not, like, but a native speaker. And the second question is, I was reading, like, something that really caught my attention was something related to report. I know that it's not like really getting into, like, a deep, I know that it wasn't the topic of the research, but I'm not sure if that's something that maybe caught your attention, like, after, like, oh, maybe we could do something related to that, like how maybe relating to your students in your L1 will, like, build, like, a relationship with them, like a more, like, a stronger relationship with them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Margarita, thank you. Both these questions are fantastic. Because so on the first question, I think the thing about the Chilean context, right? So and Spanish speakers is it's post-colonial, right? So you've got this, historical context where the use of the Spanish language was, it was an imported language. The local population kind of shifted toward everybody using Spanish as the common language. I often feel like in these post-colonial contexts, there are even more interesting opportunities for decolonizing English in these English medium, right, policies and practices. I think we often misunderstand what decolonizing is. I think I often misunderstand it myself as somebody who suggests it to people. But I think this is the thing about English only being a bad concept, is that's part of that colonial conceptualization, right? That we look at something as oh, this is it is like a power position, right? If it's only English, then English is the dominant language, and this is this is problematic in in these contexts where we should be able to draw on people's use of the local language, especially in places like Chile, where I would think, no matter where the students are coming from, that there's a strong enough Spanish proficiency level that you can use Spanish, right, to kind of support the English that's being used in the classrooms. So right, for especially kind of forward-thinking applied linguists, we look at this and go, well, that's just a kind of strange waste of resources, and so why would you do that? The thing is, if we take a kind of decolonial approach to it, we can look at something like English only from that kind of original way of thinking about translanguaging, the idea that, okay, well, we're going to use only English in this concept, in this context, or in these uses, but we're going to draw on other, right? So for example, in Chile, we're going to draw on Spanish to kind of inform what we do. Now, it's tricky because obviously if we're saying English only, then it feels like, okay, well, you're not drawing on any of those resources if you have an English only policy in a classroom where everybody can only use English the whole time. But this is where in the study, it was interesting to see, some of the negotiations especially by some of the content teachers who would say, well, I negotiated with my students, and so we do this in English and then we do this in the local language. So it's like you can kind of reinterpret English only maybe in that way of thinking about, okay, well, if as long as the policy allows for some kind of negotiation, and as long as what is decided through those negotiations makes sense for learning outcomes, then right, it can work. So there's a point, right, to kind of being able to say, no, look, we are going to kind of struggle through the use of English only to see where it takes us, and to see, what kinds of resources are we drawing on to deal with communication in English only interactions. But it doesn't have to be right the whole time. So this is us kind of coming in and recognizing, the strengths of drawing on other languages to support learning. So, but different situations, right? You can have whole classes that really are just English only, and then outside of that we do these other things. We see this in examples where especially local content teachers, local EAP teachers don't speak the local language, right? So we have plenty of examples of that, and so it has to be English only in that context. Maybe also monolingual English speakers. I mean, in East Asia, like in China and Japan, the hiring of a native English speaker was desirable, particularly when that native English speaker only spoke English. And the idea was that forces people to use English, right, in interactions with them, right? We look at that and we kind of go, oh my God, that's crazy. Why would you have a monolingual speaker who doesn't know how to learn another language be a language teacher? But that was the thinking behind all of that, and it continues today. So I think that's the thing for me in terms of responding to that first part of the question. And now I should have written it down. The second question. It's a good question.
It's about report.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, because I think this is the thing. If you can create that environment, right? So if you have that kind of comfortable space for learners, and it's about that connection, right? That if you don't have that rapport unless you can have that kind of shared, common, mutual understanding with each other. And the way to achieve that is through the use of language, right? If you as a teacher share that language with all of the students in your class, then great. Now, there are other issues, and it does come up in this data as well, that you do have cases where there may be international students in the room who don't speak that language. And then what do you do? And we see this in a lot of kind of extensive multilingual contexts, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where there's 11 languages in the classroom. Sort of like, okay, well, how do you draw on that? It's about creating spaces. So if the idea is focusing on rapport, then you figure out a way to make it work. So, where you have, so whatever you do, you don't want to exclude anyone. You want to make sure that the rapport is achieved as equally as possible with everyone in the room. So where you may have other language background users of a language that you don't share as a teacher, then you find ways to connect to that, right? And so that if it's between peers, then you do it that way. But you have to create that environment for that to happen. So I think that was, and it's like you say, right? So this isn't an area that we developed, but we did mention it because it did come up in the data that there was this idea that people said, oh, I wanted to make this connection. And so, I knew that I could do that through the language. But it's definitely an area worth exploring further because I think there are probably answers in there to policies and and even curriculum design, right? Thinking about structuring particular classes in ways so that different language background group users in a classroom can connect to what's happening in the room. So that without a kind of active policy to address that, it can get missed. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would hear more about the Chilean context. Email me. You hear about your PhD thesis.
Yes, thank you. And also Lalia, and also raise his hand. And please, the Lei. Yes. Hello. Hello.
Shout out to Marcelo. Hello, Marcelo. I said Marcelo. Sorry, I couldn't remember it was Brazilian or Portuguese.
Yes, I see the Lei. Yes. Raise his hand. Do you want to say something? Yes. Yes, and Lei, if you want to say something about.
Hello. Sorry, I lost the connection. So,
Hi, no worries.
I'm a PhD student at the university, and my topic is on the Vietnamese. So I really like your article, and I learned a lot from it. So, as people from different disciplines, from different fields, they use English differently. So they teach differently as well. So I have participants who are in engineering. So most of the time they have to use Vietnamese to communicate with their peers for the students. The lecturers, they try to communicate with the student in English. From my observation, the students, they are not really good at English, so they're struggling. But on the other hand, the business student or student in social sciences, they're really good at English. And I feel like, okay, this is not really EMI in Vietnam as well, because they are able to do similar things like this in the native English speaking country. Yeah, so to compare this one, I think it's really depends on the case, like special cases. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so good to hear from the Vietnamese context because, and you've raised such an important point that the distinction isn't necessarily institutional in terms of the use of English, but disciplinary. And yeah, we see this example, right? The uses of the English and proficiency levels of English, both by content teachers and students in the humanities and social sciences, tends to be higher than in the hard sciences. So in terms of kind of linguistic needs in engaging in teaching and learning through English in those subject areas, yeah, I mean, the needs really, really differ. There's also this point too about expectations about English use, right? That if you are going to be in the humanities and social sciences, you need to have a higher proficiency level of English because everybody else does. I still remember this as an EAP teacher at the University of Sydney. The students would come through the pre-sessionals, and they had to actually pass our center exam to be able to matriculate in their programs. And we used to guide the students with lower proficiency levels to some of the other subject areas where they weren't expected to have extended discussions in class on the readings. And, so it was things like IT and, hard sciences. And, we knew this, that, in preparing students for these subject areas, and that the requirements were different. And students would actually stay in pre-sessional programs longer if they wanted to try to achieve the ability to use English at the kind of expected level in the humanities and social sciences. It was really interesting to see. But yeah, we have a lot that we can kind of draw on and with that distinction. And that was the thing in my definition, kind of redefining EMI as one that has this focus on language skills, is it's the English skills for specific academic purposes, right? So it does have that element to recognize that there are these differences when we're talking about specific disciplines. Yeah, the kind of uses of academic English are different, that they can even be, we need to explore it further, but more cognitively demanding in particular subject areas. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the time limit, and just the 4 minutes left. But as I thought, maybe the carriers, those well, do you raise your hands just now? And I'm not sure, Jim, do you want to answer the questions? Just give more minutes, just a little short extension. Do you have times to do a short extension to answer the last questions from the Carrie Roseway?
Yeah, Charlie, you want to come in?
Hi, yeah.
Hi.
Sorry, thank you for all of the talk. I don't know that much about the EMI context really, but like my impression of it at least was often these are like private commercial universities, at least in the context where I've been, and like their kind of entire selling point is the English only approach, right? This is like what distinguishes them from the local state or government universities, which just makes me wonder when we talk about policy change, like where the impetus would be from if their entire thing that they use to define themselves and market themselves is this English only, right? And often it's in the name, like American University of wherever, and I feel like they kind of tie this, or how should I say, like they kind of make this impression that like their English only teaching is tied to a quality education, and that's like part of the whole thing. So I guess, yeah, I wonder like whether there would be any willingness to really change this, or to like officially say in policy that they let students draw on other languages. That's what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point, Charlie. I think if we have marketing of universities that say we allow students to switch and move between languages as is convenient for them, that's not a particularly good selling point. And yeah, I think both for students and parents, that there would be less interest in something like that at a policy level in terms of marketing. So I think really when we talk about these kinds of policy adaptations, I suppose we're talking about internal, institutional level, just kind of in connection with learning objectives. So I think, yeah, in a lot of ways, I suppose it's the policy that doesn't get shared, right? So, because I think otherwise, yes, I mean, English only, right? And these other universities, and we have examples of this in Poland, for example, if you're going to study in English, it's like 3 times more expensive than studying in Polish. And private, yeah, like you say, private universities, you know, they're just more expensive. But English is that kind of leg up, right, for graduates. It's sort of, you know, oh, if you have your degree from there, that means your English is good. Doesn't necessarily mean that your English is good, but that's the understanding if you have a degree from there, and so you get a better job. And, you know, there's kind of no way of combating that particular aspect, from certainly not from the applied linguistics perspective. But I think we could take all of that into consideration when thinking about these institutional policies that help shape what we do in the classroom, because that's all we can really say about them. And we have all of the evidence from not just this study, but other studies say, you know, when it comes down to it, people are pretty realistic about the policies and do whatever they can. And in some cases, that means hardly any English use at all, even if it says it's English only. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your audience participation, and a special thanks to James. Thank you for sharing your expertise and also some useful information. And I hope most of us can get some useful information and use it in the practical experience. So, and I hope in the future I will see all of you in the future session, and thank you so much. Oh, just some Vitora leave some message here.
Balib CMI Special Interest Group. Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And I'm just going to put my email address in there as well. So in case anybody wants to follow up, share any comments, if you had any questions you didn't get to ask, you can always just email me.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I hope in the future I will see you all in the future sessions. So have a nice day. Maybe the time is up. I will start recording now. And thank you so much. And have a nice day. Bye bye.
Thank you, Xiao. Thanks, everyone.